Some men lose their retirement in one dramatic moment. A single bad decision they can point to and name. A wire transfer sent in a moment of weakness. A promise believed too readily on too little evidence. This is not that kind of story. This is the story of a man who spent 4 decades catching other people's fraud for a living, who watched every single peso in his own household with genuine, obsessive precision, and who lost more money than he'd ever admit out loud to anyone at his weekly coffee morning, because he was so busy auditing the 50-peso mangoes that nobody ever thought to check the account where the real money was actually moving. I spent 40 years as an auditor, the last 22 of them as a senior partner at a mid-sized firm in Tucson, reviewing everything from small business books to the financial statements of companies considerably larger than anything I'd ever personally touch again once I retired. It's a particular kind of profession, auditing, one that trains a specific and, I used to believe, entirely admirable habit of mind, the refusal to accept a number simply because someone with authority presented it confidently. I built my entire career on exactly that refusal, catching discrepancies other reviewers missed, developing a reputation among colleagues as the partner who'd ask the uncomfortable follow-up question everyone else was too polite or too tired to ask themselves. The kind of reputation that earned me both genuine respect and, from more than a few clients over the years, a particular, exasperated dread whenever my name appeared on their engagement letter. I retired at 66, divorced 8 years earlier from my wife Patricia, in a split that was, I want to be honest, considerably more my doing than hers, the particular kind of slow professional consumption that leaves a marriage running on fumes, long before either party admits it out loud, decades of late nights closing out quarterly reviews, of bringing the same scrutinizing habit of mind home from the office in ways Patricia, quite reasonably, eventually found exhausting rather than endearing, a pattern she named plainly enough, more than once, in the years before she finally decided she'd said it enough times without any real change following. Our son Kyle, settled in Denver with his own family, called reliably but not frequently, and I found myself, in that first retired year, restless in the specific way of a man who spent 40 years finding satisfaction in catching other people's errors and suddenly has no errors left to catch. Filling the early mornings with a golf habit I never quite committed to, and long stretches of unstructured afternoon that felt, more often than I wanted to admit, like a professional identity with nowhere left to apply itself, the specific, particular boredom of a mind trained for decades to scrutinize, suddenly finding nothing left worth scrutinizing. I moved to Cebu City about 18 months after retiring, following a modest but genuine curiosity sparked by a magazine article about the cost of living, and found, within the first few months, exactly the kind of expat social circle you'd expect, a rotating group of retired Western men who met most mornings at a coffee shop near the waterfront to trade stories, complaints, and the occasional piece of genuinely useful local advice, arguing good-naturedly over which local restaurant offered the best value, comparing notes on visa renewal bureaucracy, the ordinary social scaffolding of men who'd all, in their own ways, chosen a similar late-life reinvention, a group I found myself looking forward to seeing each morning in a way that surprised me, given how solitary my working life had often been. I became, fairly quickly, something of a running joke within that group, and I want to be honest that I enjoyed the role rather more than I probably should have, if I'm being fully truthful about it. Chester the Auditor, they all called me, the man who'd disputed a 20-peso tricycle overcharge with a driver who clearly hadn't expected the argument to last as long as it did, who carried an actual laminated card in my wallet listing fair market prices for common local purchases, updated every few months as I heard about new comparison points from other expats, who'd once, memorably, made a waitress recount my change twice in front of a table full of amused fellow expats, entirely unembarrassed by the small scene it created. I told these stories myself, at coffee morning after coffee morning, with a specific, self-satisfied relish that I understand now, looking back, was less genuine humor and more a quiet performance of competence for an audience I badly wanted to see me as the one man in the room who who couldn't possibly be taken advantage of. I watched the other men in that group hemorrhage money on their girlfriends and wives, with something I can only honestly describe now as professional contempt, the specific, superior irritation of a trained fraud examiner watching amateurs walk directly into structures he'd have flagged within the first meeting. Gerald, one of the regulars, had apparently financed an entire beauty salon for a girlfriend who'd left within 4 months of the equipment arriving, a story he told with a rueful laugh that I remember privately judging as far too forgiving of his own obvious carelessness. Another man, Bill, quietly admitted one morning that he'd been sending money to a woman's sick mother for over a year without ever once seeing so much as a photograph of a hospital bill, a confession that landed at our table with an awkward silence I filled, at the time, with what I now recognize as a genuinely unkind internal satisfaction, sipping my own coffee with the quiet, unearned confidence of a man certain he'd never be foolish enough to accept a claim on faith alone. I remember thinking, with real, specific pride, that I would never make that particular category of mistake, that 40 years of professional scrutiny had built defenses in me these men had simply never developed, a certainty I carried into every subsequent conversation about money for the better part of 2 years. I met Ivy about 8 months into my time in Cebu, at a small restaurant near my apartment where she worked as a hostess, 29 years old, sharp-eyed, quick with numbers in a way I noticed and genuinely appreciated within our first few conversations. Correcting an addition error on my own bill one evening, with a directness that impressed me rather than offended me, pointing out the discrepancy before I'd even reached for my own reading glasses to check it myself, a small moment that struck me, at the time, as an unusually promising sign in a woman I'd only just met. We began seeing each other regularly over the following weeks, coffee turning into dinner, turning into longer, easier conversations that stretched well past closing time on more than one occasion, and I found in her something I hadn't expected to find at 67, a partner who seemed to actually enjoy the specific, careful way I managed money rather than finding it tiresome the way Patricia eventually had, who'd sit beside me some evenings genuinely engaged while I walked through the household ledger, asking thoughtful questions rather than the polite, glazed tolerance I'd grown accustomed to across my marriage. Ivy moved in with me about 4 months after we met, and I want to be honest that this felt, at the time, like exactly the kind of careful, considered decision a man with my professional background should have been uniquely equipped to make wisely. We lived carefully together, and I mean that with real specificity, rather than as some vague, sentimental claim. I kept a household ledger, an actual physical notebook at first before I moved the whole system onto a spreadsheet, tracking every single peso that moved through our shared expenses, groceries, utilities, the modest rent on our apartment, entertainment, the occasional splurge on a nice dinner, categorizing each entry with the same discipline I once applied to a client's chart of accounts, month after month, without a single gap or unexplained variance across nearly 2 years. Ivy handled most of the receipts, an arrangement that felt, at the time, like a natural division of labor rather than anything worth examining more closely, and I reviewed that ledger religiously, most evenings, with the same careful attention I used to bring to a client's quarterly statements, flagging anything that seemed even slightly out of pattern, a grocery bill that ran higher than our usual average, a taxi fare that seemed inflated relative to the distance traveled. I want to explain, as precisely as I can, why this particular arrangement gave me such a false and ultimately devastating sense of security. 4 decades of auditing had taught me an enormous amount about how to examine a set of transactions I already had visibility into, how to spot the small inconsistency, the pattern break, the entry that didn't quite match its supporting documentation, skills I'd honed across thousands of client engagements and dozens of genuinely difficult fraud investigations over the decades. What that same career had never once taught me, because the entire discipline is built around exactly the opposite assumption, is how to notice the category of activity that never enters your field of view at all, the transactions that happen entirely outside the ledger you've decided constitutes the full picture. I was an extraordinarily good auditor of the household, I never once thought to ask whether the household was actually the entire business, a question that would have seemed, if you'd posed it to me directly during that period, almost nonsensical, given how thoroughly the household ledger appeared to account for every aspect of our shared financial life. The condominium came up about a year into our relationship, a pre-selling opportunity Ivy mentioned initially with what struck me, at the time, as genuine excitement rather than any calculated pitch. A new development going up on the north side of the city, units available at what she described as a significant discount for early buyers willing to commit before construction was fully underway. Exactly the kind of opportunity I understood, from what little I'd read about the local property market, to be a genuinely common and often genuinely sound investment strategy for buyers willing to accept the additional risk of purchasing before a project's completion. I did what I understood to be reasonable due diligence, reviewing the developer's marketing materials, confirming the project appeared in local news coverage about the area's ongoing development, even driving out to see the construction site itself, which was, genuinely, an active, functioning site with visible progress across the months that followed. Cranes and scaffolding, and a steadily rising skeleton of concrete and rebar that I passed regularly enough to track its progress, almost the way I once tracked a client's quarterly filings, noting each visible change in a small mental ledger of its own that ran alongside the household spreadsheet, without ever once occurring to me that the two might require entirely different verification standards. I remember feeling, reviewing those materials, a specific professional satisfaction, certain that a man with my background couldn't possibly be walking into anything remotely resembling a scam, that the physical, visible reality of the construction itself constituted a kind of verification no fraudster could realistically fabricate. What I never once did, and this is the specific, devastating failure I've had to sit with in the months since, was treat the condo purchase as its own separate financial matter, requiring its own independent audit trail, entirely apart from the household ledger I was tracking so carefully every single evening. Ivy offered, early on, to manage the paperwork with the developer directly, explaining that she had a cousin who worked in real estate and understood the local pre-selling process considerably better than I did, that the deposit schedule and documentation would go more smoothly if she coordinated it rather than me navigating an unfamiliar bureaucratic system as a foreigner. An explanation that struck me, at the time, as not just reasonable, but genuinely considerate, the kind of practical division of labor that made sense, given the real gaps in my own local knowledge. I agreed to this arrangement without much resistance, telling myself, with the exact kind of misplaced confidence that makes this whole story worth telling, that the household ledger remained clean and accurate, and that the household ledger was, in my own mind, the entire scope of financial activity I actually needed to supervise. The deposit structure, as Ivy explained it to me, involved staged payments over roughly 14 months, each transfer going to what she described as the developer's escrow account, a standard practice, she assured me, for pre-selling arrangements in the Philippines, designed to protect buyers by holding funds separately until specific construction milestones were reached. An explanation that matched, closely enough, the general concept of escrow protections I already understood from my own professional background, which is precisely why I never thought to question the specific account details any further than confirming the general structure sounded appropriately protective. I transferred the first deposit, $12,000, via wire transfer to the account number Ivy provided, watching the confirmation come through, with the same modest satisfaction I used to feel, closing out a well-documented client file, printing the confirmation, and filing it neatly into a folder I'd already labeled for the purpose, and continued transferring additional installments roughly every 6 weeks over the following year, watching the total climb steadily, as construction, by every visible measure during my periodic drives past the site, appeared to be genuinely progressing. I want to be honest about the specific quality of confidence I felt across that entire 14-month period, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how thoroughly the whole structure worked on a man who genuinely believed himself professionally immune to precisely this kind of deception. Each individual transfer felt, at the moment I authorized it, like a carefully verified transaction, supported by a construction site I'd personally observed, a developer whose name appeared in legitimate local news coverage, a deposit schedule that matched what Ivy's cousin had apparently confirmed was standard local practice, a set of independently reasonable-sounding facts that I never once thought to actually cross-reference against each other as a single. What I never once did, across 14 months and $105,000 in cumulative transfers, was independently verify that the specific account receiving my money actually belonged to the developer at all, rather than assuming, based entirely on Ivy's representation and my own general confidence in the project's visible legitimacy, that the connection between the two was simply a fact I didn't need to separately confirm. The first genuine crack came about a year into the deposit schedule, at one of our regular coffee mornings, when Gerald, of all people, the same man whose beauty salon investment I'd once privately judged with such confidence, mentioned in passing that his own girlfriend's cousin, also apparently involved in local real estate, had described a specific pre-selling development on the north side of the city that had recently drawn some quiet concern among people who actually worked in the local property market. Concerns about whether the escrow arrangements on the project were being properly managed. A conversation I remember Gerald relaying almost as idle gossip. No idea the specific weight it would carry for the man sitting directly across the table from him. I remember the specific, cold feeling that moved through me hearing that description, recognizing, with mounting unease, that it matched the development I'd been paying into for nearly a year. The coffee in front of me going cold, while I asked Gerald 2 or 3 careful follow-up questions, trying to sound casual, while my own pulse was doing anything but, my hand not quite steady enough around the cup for the effort to fully succeed. I didn't say anything to the group beyond those questions. I went home that same afternoon and, for the first time in the entire 14-month process, actually pulled the account details Ivy had provided and attempted to independently verify them through channels entirely separate from her own explanations. What I found, over the following several days of increasingly urgent research, working through contacts at my old firm and a local attorney I retained specifically for this purpose, a careful, methodical woman named Corazon Villarreal, who took my case with a seriousness that only deepened my growing dread as she worked through it, sitting across from me in her small, orderly office, lined with case files stacked in careful, labeled towers, a grave, patient expression on her face as she walked me through what her own preliminary checks had turned up over the course of that first difficult meeting, was that the account receiving my deposits belonged not to the developer at all, but to a separate shell entity, registered under a name I didn't recognize, with a single listed signatory, a man named Renato, who I learned, through a conversation with Ivy I've replayed more times than I can count since, was her sister's husband. I confronted Ivy with this information on an ordinary Tuesday evening, laying out everything Corazon had helped me uncover, the shell entity, the mismatched account, her brother-in-law's name on the signatory line, the printed documents spread across our own kitchen table with a formality that felt, even to me in the moment, uncomfortably close to a client meeting rather than a conversation with the woman I'd shared a home with for nearly 2 years, the overhead light suddenly feeling far too bright for what the room was actually about to hold. I want to describe her reaction honestly, because it wasn't the immediate, dramatic collapse I might have expected from a lifetime of watching similar confrontations play out in other people's stories. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, with a calm that unsettled me more than any outburst could have, "Chester, the money is being used for the condo. Renato is helping manage the construction payments, so everything moves faster. This is normal. You don't understand how these projects actually work here." I asked her, directly, whether I could see documentation connecting the shell entity to the actual developer. Any formal agreement establishing Renato's account as a legitimate intermediary in the transaction. She didn't have one to show me. She told me she would get it from Renato, and that request, made 3 times over the following 2 weeks, was never once fulfilled. Each subsequent attempt met with a fresh explanation for the delay that I recognized, even as I heard it, as the exact category of deferral I'd have flagged instantly in any professional context, but had somehow, in my own home, allowed to pass without proper scrutiny for days at a time. There was a specific evening, about 2 months into the deposit schedule, that I've come to think of differently in hindsight than I did at the time. One of the very few moments across the entire 14 months where some small, unexamined discomfort actually surfaced in me before I talked myself back out of it. I'd asked Ivy, almost idly, whether I might sit in on her next call with Renato about the payment schedule, more out of general curiosity than any specific suspicion, the same kind of casual interest I might have shown in any ordinary household matter. She hesitated, just slightly, before explaining that Renato preferred to keep business calls separate from personal relationships, that involving me directly might complicate what was otherwise a smooth, efficient arrangement between family members who already understood each other's working styles. A brief pause in her voice I noticed at the time and let pass without comment, the kind of small hesitation that a younger, sharper version of myself would once have flagged instantly in a client interview and pressed on rather than accepted. I remember accepting that explanation almost immediately, filing it away as a reasonable boundary rather than the warning sign I now recognize it clearly was. The same instinct that had once made me insist on direct access to every layer of a client's operations, somehow going quiet the moment the request touched my own personal life, rather than someone else's business. I want to explain something about the specific, professional humiliation of what I discovered next, because it's the part of this story that has stayed with me longer than the financial loss itself. I finally did what I should have done from the very first deposit, treating the condo purchase as its own independent audit subject rather than an extension of the household ledger I'd been tracking so carefully, and pulled every piece of documentation I could access, the developer's actual registered corporate filings, the genuine escrow account structure the development was supposed to be using according to publicly available regulatory filings, the construction timeline against actual payment milestones, laying it all out across my dining table, the way I once laid out a client's full year of financials before a difficult audit committee meeting. What I found, laid out with the same clarity I'd once have presented to a client, was a scheme so simply constructed that I felt, alongside the devastation, a specific kind of professional shame at having missed it. Staged deposits collected under the appearance of a legitimate pre-selling arrangement, routed through an account that had no actual contractual relationship with the real development at all, the genuine, visible construction site, serving simply as convincing cover for money moving somewhere else entirely. The condominium itself, I eventually confirmed, was real, being built by an actual developer with actual buyers, most of whom, unlike me, had paid their deposits directly to the developer's genuinely verified escrow account, rather than through an intermediary their girlfriend's brother-in-law happened to control. A fact I confirmed by contacting the developer's sales office directly, a conversation that felt, even as I was having it, like watching the last piece of my own denial finally give way entirely. My own name, I discovered through Corazone's careful investigation, appeared nowhere in the developer's actual buyer records at all. I had spent 14 months and $105,000 purchasing a unit I had never actually been registered as purchasing, paying an account that had never once been contractually connected to the property whose construction I'd been driving past every few weeks, taking quiet, misplaced comfort in its visible progress, cranes rising, concrete pouring, an entire physical reality that had nothing whatsoever to do with where my money had actually gone. I called my old colleague Frank, still active at the firm back in Tucson after all these years, about a week after this full picture had assembled itself, needing to describe the mechanics to someone who could actually appreciate the specific structure of what had happened to me. Sitting in my apartment, with my laptop open to the same folder of documents I'd shown Corazon, walking Frank through the whole thing detail by detail, the way we used to walk each other through a particularly gnarled client file over the phone late in the evening. He listened to the whole account without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying, with a directness I appreciated more than I let on, "Chester, I'm not going to lie to you, the mechanics here are almost elegant. Real underlying asset, real visible progress, a completely separate capital account with no actual contractual connection to any of it. If a client had brought us financials structured this cleanly around a legitimate business, we'd have had a hard time catching it either, unless someone specifically thought to check the connection between the visible asset and the account actually receiving payment. I told him that was, in its own devastating way, almost a comfort, and he said, gently, "It should be some comfort, Chester, but I think you already know the real problem wasn't the scheme's sophistication. It's that you were watching an entirely different ledger the whole time." I sat with that observation for a long time after we hung up, turning it over the way I once turned over a difficult client engagement, recognizing, with real clarity, that Frank had summarized in a single sentence the entire year and a half I'd already spent trying, less successfully, to articulate to myself. I contacted the Philippine authorities through Corazon's guidance, filing a formal complaint that has moved, in the months since, at the same specific pace I understand these cases generally move, slowly, with periodic updates that convey activity without ever quite conveying resolution. Corazon herself managing my expectations early on, with a patience I came to appreciate more the longer the process dragged. I retained a separate attorney in the United States to explore whether any recovery might be possible through my original wire transfers, and received, after considerable expense, essentially the same sobering assessment Corazon had already given me locally, that recovery in cases structured this particular way, across international jurisdictions, with the receiving account already largely emptied by the time the fraud was discovered, remained genuinely unlikely regardless of how clearly documented the underlying scheme actually was, a conclusion I'd have delivered to a client myself, in earlier years, with exactly the same clinical, unwelcome honesty. Ivy left about 3 weeks after our confrontation, quietly and without ceremony, taking her own belongings and leaving no forwarding address. A departure that felt, by that point, less like a dramatic betrayal and more like the final, logical step in a structure that had simply run its course once its actual mechanism could no longer be concealed. The apartment feeling, in the days afterward, less emptied by grief and more simply audited down to its remaining, verifiable facts. The closets half empty, the shelf where she'd kept her own small collection of things, suddenly bare in a way that took me longer to notice than it probably should have. I don't know, even now, exactly how much of our relationship existed alongside a genuine, calculated plan from the very beginning, versus how much may have started as something closer to real affection that gradually curdled into opportunity once the pre-selling scheme presented itself as a viable structure. A distinction I've had to make my uneasy peace with never fully resolving, turning it over some evenings without ever quite landing on an answer I fully trust, no matter how many times I run the same limited set of facts back through my own head. I called Kyle about a month after Ivy left, sitting in the same apartment we'd once shared, and told him everything, start to finish, the ledger, the condo, the shell account, the $105,000, sparing him none of the details I might have once softened for a son I'd spent much of his adult life trying to appear reasonably competent in front of. He was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then he said something that has stayed with me since, delivered without any particular edge, simply a plain observation from a son who'd inherited at least some of my own analytical instincts, the kind of steady, unhurried delivery I recognized as distinctly my own, even as it landed like a genuine blow. "Dad, you spent 40 years teaching me that the biggest frauds hide in plain sight, dressed up as something boring and legitimate. I don't think you ever once applied that lesson to yourself. You were so busy watching the mangoes." I told him he was exactly right, and that the specific, humbling irony of it had been keeping me awake more nights than I wanted to admit to him directly, that I'd spent 40 years teaching younger auditors exactly the principle he'd just handed back to me, unprompted, in a single sentence, a son summarizing his father's own life's work more precisely than the father had ever managed to apply it to himself. I went back to my coffee morning group about 6 weeks after Ivy left, and I want to describe that particular return honestly, because it required a specific kind of humility I hadn't previously known I was capable of producing. Walking into that same coffee shop with a version of the story I'd never once imagined I'd be the one telling, rather than judging. Gerald, whose own beauty salon loss I'd once privately judged with such quiet, professional superiority, was the first to speak once I'd finished laying out the whole account for the group. The whole table quiet, in a way I recognized, uncomfortably, as the exact silence I'd once sat inside listening to his own story, with far less generosity than he now extended to mine. He didn't gloat, which I'll credit him for entirely. He simply said, "Chester, we've all got our own version of this story. Yours just had better paperwork than most of ours did going in." I found something genuinely useful in that observation, the recognition that the specific mechanism of my own loss, however professionally embarrassing given my career, wasn't fundamentally different in kind from what every other man in that group had experienced. Only different in the particular shape of the blindness that had made it possible. A realization that didn't erase the shame exactly but did, slowly, over the following weeks, begin to reshape it into something closer to shared experience than private disgrace. A distinction that mattered more to my own recovery than I expected it to. I've spent a considerable amount of time since trying to understand exactly what happened to my own professional instincts across that 14-month period, and I've arrived, slowly, at an explanation I find both genuinely illuminating and difficult to fully accept. 40 years of auditing had trained me to be extraordinarily good at scrutinizing a defined scope of transactions, at catching the small inconsistency within a bounded set of records I'd already agreed constituted the full picture, a skill so deeply grooved by decades of repetition that it had become close to instinctive, requiring no conscious effort to apply once a scope had been settled. What that same training had never once required of me, because the professional discipline itself doesn't typically demand it, was the harder, more uncomfortable question of whether the scope itself had been correctly drawn, whether the household ledger I was tracking so meticulously actually represented the entire universe of financial activity happening around me, or only the portion someone else had decided to let me see clearly, a question that, once I finally learned to ask it, I now apply almost reflexively to every financial arrangement I enter into, however small or seemingly straightforward it appears. I think about my laminated card of fair market prices often now, still in my wallet, though I no longer take it out at coffee mornings the way I once did with such performative pride, the specific, small vigilance I once took such genuine pride in, disputing a 20-peso tricycle overcharge with the same seriousness I once brought to a multi-million-dollar corporate audit, treating each small dispute as further proof of my own vigilance, rather than what I now understand it actually was, a form of vigilance theater performed largely for my own benefit and the amusement of my coffee morning audience. I understand now, with a clarity that arrived considerably too late to matter, that this vigilance, real as it was, had never actually protected me from anything that mattered, because the men who might have overcharged me 20 pesos for a tricycle ride were never the actual threat to my retirement in the first place. I owe an apology, genuinely and without qualification, to every tricycle driver in Cebu I ever accused, across those coffee morning stories I used to tell, with such self-satisfied relish, of trying to cheat a foreigner. They were never the ones robbing me. I was simply so busy watching them closely that I never once thought to look anywhere else, spending years of careful, misdirected attention on exactly the wrong category of risk, while the genuinely consequential threat moved, entirely unexamined, through paperwork I delegated without a second thought. I don't hate Ivy, though this conclusion arrived considerably more slowly and with considerably more difficulty than it did for some of the other losses I've had to process across a long, complicated life, months of turning the whole affair over on quiet evenings, before I could arrive at anything resembling this settled a view. I think she found, somewhere in her own history, a genuinely effective structure for extracting money from exactly the kind of man I turned out to be. A man whose professional confidence in his own scrutiny made him uniquely unlikely to ever look beyond the specific ledger he'd already decided constituted his full field of vision, a vulnerability she may have recognized within our very first conversations about how I actually managed money, long before either of us ever mentioned a condominium. I don't think that understanding excuses what happened to my retirement savings. $105,000 is $105,000 regardless of the psychology or the specific family structure underneath it. But I've stopped needing her to have been simply, cartoonishly calculating in order for my own losses to make sense, the same way I've stopped needing myself to have been simply careless. I was, by every measure that mattered to my own self-conception, extraordinarily careful. I was careful about precisely the wrong scope. I still live in Cebu City, still attend the coffee mornings most weeks, though the tone of my own contributions has changed considerably since this whole affair became common knowledge among the group. The running joke retired along with the story that used to fuel it, replaced by something closer to the role Gerald and Bill once occupied, a cautionary example other men now reference gently, rather than a source of easy amusement. I tell newer arrivals, when the conversation allows for it, the same thing every time. The lesson I wish someone had given me before I ever agreed to let anyone else manage a single piece of paperwork connected to money I couldn't independently trace. Watching your household spending carefully is not the same thing as being financially safe. It's simply evidence that you know how to watch one particular, bounded category of transaction closely. The real question, the one I never once thought to ask across 40 years of professional practice and 18 months of genuine, devastating personal experience, is whether the category you've chosen to watch actually contains the risk that matters, or whether you've simply built yourself an elaborate, satisfying performance of control, while the actual danger moved, entirely unexamined, through an account you never once thought belonged inside your scope at all. I've started, in the months since, actually reviewing every financial arrangement in my life the way I once only reviewed a client's, asking not just whether the numbers I can see add up, but whether there might be an entire category of numbers I've simply never thought to ask about, a discipline I apply now to bank accounts, to insurance policies, even to the small joint expenses I share with a new, considerably more cautiously vetted circle of local friends. It's a harder way to live than the confident, laminated card version of myself I used to be, more genuinely humble, and considerably less entertaining at a coffee morning. But I've come to believe it's the only version of careful that actually deserves the name, the kind that asks not just whether you're watching closely, but whether you're watching the right thing at all.